Welcome to the Embodiment Podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with embodiment specialists from around the world. I'm your host, Mark Walsh. So joining me from Cambridge today, a friend, a colleague, someone I respect very much. Beverly Nolan is a yoga teacher. She's a therapist. She works one-to-one. She's a faculty member for the Integrative Bodywork and Movement Therapy, teaches UK, Russia, Lithuania, all over the place. Works one-to-one, small groups, trauma-sensitive stuff, journaling, a lot of stuff, a lot of strings to her bow. So Beverly, welcome.
Thank you very much. Glad to be with you.
And how did you get interested in working with the body? What was your route into this?
I guess it was just, that's going back on. I guess just the straightforward yoga route. So I've been a practitioner for a long time. I trained as a teacher back in the middle of the 80s. So, and I think actually it was going to adult education yoga that brought me home to the body, because my experience of sort of sport and dance at school in my younger years was not so great. So I think it was adult ed yoga that brought me home to my body.
So you weren't coming out of a particular injury or particular difficulty, you just went to yoga and thought, oh, this is nice, this.
Yeah, I was blessed with a really amazing teacher to start off with. She was a visiting teacher from Australia, an Iyengar teacher, and she was also training to be an Alexander teacher. So she was already bringing something new to the pot, as it were. So I was very lucky to have an inspiring teacher right from the start.
So you had some good yoga background. And then what about the dance movement therapy? I know you're a student of Linda Hartley's, who we both know. What got you into that side of things?
I got, over the years, eventually I found Donna Fahy as a teacher and read one of Donna's books that referenced something called body-mind centering, which is as you know, an embodiment form, a somatic form of or approach to moving that was created by Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen. So I found this reference in the back of Donna's book, and I thought, well, I wonder if there's anyone in the UK who does this body-mind centering thing. And that led me to find Linda and to discover that she was doing a training program in Essex, which, as you know, is not very far from Cambridge. So I hooked up, did some introductory workshops, and then did a full training with Linda.
Great. And I think you're the first dance movement therapist we've had on the show, actually. So for those that think of sort of therapy as sitting and talking, tell me about your parents kind of stuff, could you explain a little bit about how dance movement therapy and body mind centering, I know it's a different modality, but how do they work? What does that look like? Okay,
so firstly, I'm not a dance movement therapist. That's a different training, but certainly I'm a movement therapist. So we start from the premise, I think, that all of our stories are lived through the body. All of our geography and our history is stored in the body. And that while talking is one way of discovering ourselves, allowing our stories to move, allowing our feelings to move, allowing our impulses to move is another way of processing our material and another journey of self-discovery. So I actually find I work alongside, or I work with especially one-to-one clients who are also in a talking therapy, and I'm a kind of ancillary worker, a therapist, and I provide a place where they can move their story.
And what does working with the body bring in addition? Someone say, hey, therapy works, talking to people, that's enough. I'm playing devil's advocate here, obviously. Like, was working with the body, what does that bring to the therapeutic, as either an addition or instead of the regular kind of therapy?
Well, I think I've heard it said often, and I think you've also said it, we're not just a brain that's walking around. Our systems are whole body systems. Our brain is a whole body system. So our stories are whole body stories. So by only choosing to move your story through your languaging or through talking is one way, and it can work very well. But there's a whole other terrain to explore through the body.
And can you give an example of someone, and obviously you can change the names, or, what would be an example of someone working with this?
Oh, well, I can use me. How about that? That's probably...
Oh, even better. I like personal stories. Personal stories are always good on the show.
Yeah, well, it's a small story, but it highlighted for me how useful the body can be in throwing a light on a story. So when I first met Linda, and had a one-to-one session with her, and we didn't know which way into my stories or into the body we would go, but she asked me just to name a place where perhaps I had tension, or a habitual place. So I picked this place, which happened to be a shoulder. And then we started to unpick this and find out what were the layers here. Was it just a structural tension? Was there any language or imagery that came with this part of the body? So we unpicked that, and then we did some movement, some body work, and then some free movement around the shoulder that unpicked a whole story about around this word of protection that I had lodged somewhere in my shoulder. And what we discovered was that actually the story was complete, and I didn't really need to be holding this layer of protection in my shoulder. So I could release, as I realized the story was complete, I realized that this muscular tension was no longer required, as no longer of service, and I could begin to let it go.
So, Beverly, often I find that the body can kind of go straight to the root of things. It can circumnavigate a lot of talk, or provide insights that maybe wouldn't come so easily through talking, a way of kind of revealing things, and also a way of kind of very directly working on things as well, right?
Yes. I agree.
just that. You agree? All right, fair enough.
So much better than I could.
Excuse me. So the body mind centering approach, can you say a little bit about that? We might be able to get Bonnie on the show at some point if someone can introduce me, but that would be a bit of a dream. She's hard to get hold of, and I know you're well qualified in that work through Linda, who's also pretty tricky, semi-retired essentially these days, one of the sort of big names in the field in the UK. Can you say a little bit about what that approach is? I know it seems to be many-stranded, and I always find quite hard to get a kind of handle on what it is.
For me, I think there's something in the title itself, body mind centering, and for me, what that conveys is that wherever I put my attention in my body is the center for my experience. So there are many centers, as it were. When you study body mind centering principles, or actually study to be a body mind centering practitioner, you will study the body in quite a lot of detail, the different body systems, anything from the bones to the muscle systems, nervous system, endocrine. It's all separated into particular techniques of study. And by focusing on a particular system or a particular structure, again, as I said about the shoulder, we can start to unpick it and find that there are different experiences. When I place my attention in my organ systems, it's different. My lived experience seems to be different than when I place my attention in my bony system, for example. So there are these different expressive qualities, if you like, different ways of being human wherever you place your experience, your attention in the body.
And it is interesting, isn't it? Like, you could use it almost typologically as well. I'm fairly sort of muscular, and some people are much more kind of in the skin. And by muscular, I don't mean that I have big muscles. I mean that sense of sort of doing an activity is something I'm very aware of. Other people, there's a whole system of yoga. John Stirk, who's very interested in the skin. And you go to Pete Blackaby's yoga class, and he's an osteopath, and it's all about bones. I mean, it's more than that. I don't want to put any of these guys in a box, but it's, it's very much, and with Gary, it's the fascia. And all these different teachers, because there's so much in these different systems, and we're continuously referring you to different systems, there's a very different felt sense that comes from that. And that's something people practice. Like, they could pause this podcast, couldn't they, and just walk around paying attention to bones, and then walk around paying attention to muscles or skin, and do the experiment, right? And it's surprisingly different, the state that comes.
Yes, absolutely. The way of being in your own body, but also the way that you might be relating to others as well, can shift depending where your attention is in the body. That's for sure. The other thing, I think, with Linda's training, and I guess also with the BMC training, there's this sense of your body becomes quite a receiver. So we sort of picking up, well, when I'm with this particular person, why am I sensing that I'm more in my endocrine system? Why am I sensing, my liver is really, really present when I'm talking to this person, for example? So I don't know whether it's an empathy or whatever, but we learn to pay attention to our own body as a sort of receiver.
And how does that look like? So someone listening to a podcast essentially is in a relationship, right? And me and you, we're chatting, haven't seen each other in a little while, we're catching up, we're, having a conversation. How is it going to be different if I'm sort of more present to, say, my skin or more present to my organs?
Well, I can't say how that would be different for you.
Well, what's the pattern? There's a pattern, right? There's no system without a pattern.
Yeah. So if I am more in my skin, I'm going to perhaps be, for me, when I'm more attending to being in my skin system, I might have a much wider sense of being present, a wider sense of what's going on around me, not just in my immediate vision. So my skin is this all enveloping layer of the body. If I bring my attention to it, personally, I will be much more aware of my 360 environment. If I'm thinking about my bones when I'm with somebody or in a particular situation, I'm probably thinking more about how my form, my structure, where are my lines of support in my body. So those kind of things might change.
And do you see the kind of habitual attention in people, so that what would be the kind of more different ways of being that you would see where people are habitually kind of more in one of these systems, as it were?
I would say we probably do have favoured systems. I'm quite a skin and I'm quite a fluid kind of person. I find it less easy to be in my muscles. When I'm in my muscles, I'm much it takes me more effort to be in my muscle place. But I like being there once I get there. So I have habitual places that are perhaps softer and perhaps more receptive, if we can use those words, than a muscle body, which, as you were saying, might have more action, more doing to it.
Yeah, I often feel that my entire body is just orientated around the muscles. There's bones for the muscles to pull on, and there's skin to contain the muscles, and it's quite visceral for me.
Yeah.
But if I've been doing any weight training, even more so, I've noticed that actually builds that way of being, because I'm even more aware of the muscles. Where if I've been in the sauna or getting like a gentle massage, I'm much more in my skin, and that's sometimes very helpful for me to come back into that kind of sensual body away from the doing body, for example.
Yeah, I would agree.
And what about the sort of deep organs? Because the sort of muscles, bones, skin, fascia, that all makes sense to me as a yogi. But the idea of kind of feeling into the organs, like, part of me wonders if that's just fanciful, or, like say more about that kind of deep, visceral feeling into.
Well, I think the way into the organs is to think about the body being having content and a container. So we could say that maybe skin, muscles, bones, fascia, well, not fascia, but there are certain layers of the body that feel like the container. And inside that container, we have the content. So we have the organs, the glands, the fluids, the vessels, for example. So once I have this idea in my head that there is a container and there's content, the content then starts to become more alive. It starts to take on a sense of volume and presence and density. And that's why we spend a lot of time rolling around to try and get this sense of the volume of the body shifting, not just and gravity, not just shifting through bones and muscles, but also shifting through the internal organs as well. And when we bring more presence and more connection to the organs, we find that can help support the bony muscular structures. Yeah? So it gives internal support.
It's definitely possible, isn't it, to build a greater sense of these organs? Like, now it's fairly easy for me to feel my heart beating in my chest. Now, I didn't used to be able to do that, just very physically, very literally. I could take my pulse, but I couldn't now it's, I can just stop talking and feel it for a moment. And it's a really lovely thing to be able to feel kind of in my body. And that is, I don't think my heart has particularly changed since I couldn't do that. I think it's just the fact that I've got better at kind of feeling into myself, and then feeling into the guts and noticing some of those kind of movements kind of deep inside has a different, again, a different quality to it for people that may be used to doing sort of martial arts or more muscular kind of athletic dance. There's something about sort of slowing down, isn't there, and feeling into the guts and the viscera and, you know, deep inside that it's perhaps not going to be so obvious for people doing embodied practices that are quite athletic.
Yeah, but that's just, for me, that would just be a question of opening up the mind and just trying something new, because certainly if you think about your legs, if you think about the origin of the legs being in the in the large intestine, like in the ascending and descending colon, suddenly you've got really long legs with really springy, powerful origins in the abdomen. So it could be, I think in a playful way you could certainly introduce more athletic, muscly oriented folks into the organ body. And
another piece I've seen as quite core to body mind centering is embryology work. So this popped up when I last saw you. Actually, the lovely Amy Matthews was doing a workshop of embodied anatomy, and you know how getting to know our anatomy can really change our sort of felt sense of the body. And she did a little bit on embryology, and I kind of asked a dumb question. You know, I was like, okay, I don't get this. Like, what's the point? You know, like we're studying the development of an embryo. I don't understand why that is interesting or useful. And she gave a very good answer, actually, and it was something along the lines of, well, by studying the very early days of how we're formed, that influences us still today. So aside from being just, you know, a little bit interesting in and of itself, how did you get to be is quite a fascinating subject. But there's this way in which studying that can influence our view of ourselves now. I mean, do you want to say a little bit about that? Because this is definitely not my area.
Yeah. It's fascinating that to become human involves movement right from the word go. And so we know movement is an inherent part of being alive, but also in the formation of becoming human, it's all through it seems to be a very orchestrated, I'm moving my hands around here, sorry, to try and help me find the words. That's kind of embodied, searching for language. So and something else that we're working with Linda as well is that the development of our sense of self certainly begins in utero. Now, where that begins, who knows? But if you unpick everything back to embryology, you could trace back the sense of self right from the dot, as it were. And I think that's why it's important for BMC people and IBMT people to unravel where this sense of self comes from, because it's the sense of self and the development of self-agency through the in utero and the first year, 18 months, that's very illuminating to our adult selves.
So it gives an insight into our adult selves. I guess that's the key thing here, right? And
that's my experience.
Is there anything that might be surprising to people? Because the little I've studied, I was quite like, whoa, okay, I just thought it was like a blob of cells and it just kind of got bigger. And, you know, it's not necessarily common sense, is it? Like how the embryo develops.
Not to us, maybe, no. There must be some sense to it somehow. A lot of people have got bring insights to this. The work of Stan Groff's really interesting. He's developed a piece of work called the Perinatal Matrix, talking about the birthing experience and how that influences our sense of self and development of self-agency. And now, as I say, it's what's happening now is the in utero period is also being unraveled to see if we can understand where the origin of the self begins. And this is where this all comes back to yoga for me. This is why when at times I've lost faith in sort of asana practice, whole journey of embodiment seems to then link me right back into what the yoga journey is all about.
Yeah, let's talk more about yoga, because it's, you know, I'm looking at Amy Matthews doing the embodied anatomy, or Aki, you know, colleague of yours I know in London. I went to her class a few times, very good, but, you know, very different. And I see some of you guys, your colleagues, Linda Hartley students who also do yoga. And it's a very different kind of yoga, isn't it, that's emerging. It's not yoga how people might think of as sort of doing tree posture or a downwards dog. there's quite a lot of kind of the emphasis on feeling, the emphasis on exploring, a lot of rolling around on the floor in a kind of freeway. What does yoga look like when you're informed by things like embodied anatomy and embryology?
I think it becomes, and this is why I think I've then found my way into trauma sensitive yoga. It becomes much more invitational and less instructional. As a yoga teacher, I might be suggesting, or I might have an idea of a class plan or a theme, but where each individual goes with it is me saying, what is your felt experience at this time? I can't tell you what's going on in your body. So if there's something about maybe this wave bringing through more empowerment to the student, so this hopefully a shifting of this, a change in what this whole student-teacher dynamic is.
Yeah, I mean, the student-teacher dynamic kind of used to be this old school, teacher knows best. They have kind of rights over your body. That normally led to all kinds of physical, sexual, and financial abuse. And very disempowering for the student, because the student essentially was learning on a number of levels. I use learning in the wider sense that they're not the boss of their own body. It's not their experience that matters. And now there's this swing towards a sort of more the subjective, more the personal, more the individualized, of sort of like, well, what's your experience here? As you kind of used to sort of said to me earlier, well, what's your experience of that? And it often seems to be much kind of freer, less form orientated. And certainly there's an implication, isn't there, in terms of autonomy and how students are treated. And it can feel very spacious and open compared to kind of old. I kind of wonder if it's not swinging too far in that direction. I wonder if there's not a happy middle, but a sort of yin and yang thing here. But
yeah, I think you're right, because I think the invitational approach is very new. A lot of people sign up for yoga classes because they want to learn how to do a tree pose, safely. Or how to do a vinyasa sequence or something. And I totally get that. And to suddenly, if you're signing up to a class where you have a teacher, the natural expectation, I think, would be that the teacher's going to tell me what to do. And and so you might go to a more of a somatic kind of approach to yoga, where it's very invitational, and you could be totally at sea, and you could probably hate it from beginning to end.
People could feel a bit lost, can't they?
Because you came there at the end of your working day just to switch off and be told what to do, not to be invited to explore what your liver's doing when you do a twisting pose.
I had a very small class. It was very dark, cold night. Just two students last night in my embodied yoga class, and they're both kind of advanced people. One that had done a lot of free dance work as well, and it was really interesting moving between these polarities with them, between sort of discipline and form and structure. And this is the form, because we have these set forms in EYP, as you know, and then moving to a very somatic, exploratory approach. And it's like, you can even roll off your mat. It's radical. Oh, yeah. And they're not trapped on the triangle, And we did sort of both ends of the spectrum, and it was really funny to see like which they were. We had one person who was really longing for structure. They'd just been backpacking around Thailand, and they just really wanted structure. And someone else that was just like, don't cage me in. And like their whole personality was just like, I just want freedom, and I don't want to be told what to do. And it was very interesting to see to put both of those things in a single class.
Yeah, interesting. And maybe it's not that we're looking for a watered down one or the other. It's just that now we have a wider spectrum of choice. We can go to the very structured classes, or we can go to the more invitational, explorative classes. So,
and this invitational thing. So, Sarah Holmes de Castro is over. He's a British Canadian teacher who I really like. She's doing trauma sensitive yoga in Brighton, and I'd never heard, obviously she's Canadian as well as being trauma sensitive, and I'd never heard anyone be quite so invitational. Every single thing was an invitation. And I'm used to martial arts teachers who are like, do this or I hit you with a stick kind of thing, and I'm fairly authoritative in how I tend to teach because of that lineage. As you know, you've seen me on EFC, right? You've been guest teacher there. But I always very much hold like, look, if you don't want to do this, you don't have to. And as you know, on EFC, people take breaks and they have a sleep, and we have a whole space for that. So on the one hand, it's a matter of like style, isn't it? Like personality, teaching style. But on the other hand, there is like this, are you genuinely able to opt out? because that for me is the key. It's not if someone uses a soft voice, or, you know, even more like uses the word invitation. Like, I invite you to do what the fuck I say. Sometimes, like, you know, I'm hear people using the word invite or invitation, but the tone is just threatening, and like there's a subtle sort of pressure being applied there. Whereas someone else can say, hey, guys, do this in a really straightforward yang kind of way. And then, but if someone says, hey, I don't want to do it, they go, okay, cool, take a rest.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's like, it's partly the words, it's partly the flavor, the embodiment, and it's partly the consequence when people say no. It's a bit rambling. What do you think to all this invitational style?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. You can be invitational in a yang way, if we can call it that. It's the intention of the facilitator. Do they really mean that it's okay for someone to take a rest, or, you know, or to do something, to do a completely different pose than the one that's been suggested? Is the teacher really okay with that?
Yeah.
And you'll soon know if they're not.
Right. I see a lot of sort of what I'd call subtle fascism, where it's like they're really, and I feel this in myself sometimes, you know, like I say, yeah, you can do this or not do this, and then I feel a part of me that's just like, yeah, but I want you to do it. And sometimes that's just like the, you know, ordering a class. I was teaching a stress workshop today for a small business, and you know, just people were kind of talking and laughing at a point, which is just disruptive to the class. And I found myself getting controlling. And it's like, okay, was that good for the class, or is that just that I want to be in control? There's a whole sort of process that you can be aware of, isn't there, as a embodiment teacher? Like, who's this for?
Yes, exactly. You can almost enter a state of paralysis and not do anything at all, because you have to be totally clear on your intentions, and what you're bringing as you take as a teacher or facilitator, you're taking that kind of front of the room spot. So there's automatically a dynamic that's been set up, and then you're standing there sort of holding, as you say in inverted commas, holding a space, making invitations. But are you really, or are you teaching?
Yeah. And I wonder, like, I really wish that more embodiment teachers understood power dynamics, because as soon as you're in front of a room, even if you're softly spoken and mild-mannered, people are projecting that onto you. You're their parents, you're their school teachers, and they're going to, what I realize is actually it's difficult to get real consent in that position, because people are wanting to say yes, except for the 10% of people are rebels and they want to do the opposite, right? But 90% of people are going to be wanting to do what you say because they want to be a good boy or good girl. So it's really difficult to even genuinely be invitational. And then the other thing I think that complicates it is some people seem to not feel safe unless there's a very clear lead. Like, we both work in Russia. I see it a lot there. Like, we had feedback from you on EFC, like most people like, oh, I really loved her kind of yin invitational approach. It was so different from yours, Mark. It's a really nice contrast. And I was like, yep, that's why we get Beverly in. So we want to show you as a contrast to me. And then a couple of people were like, actually, I just totally didn't feel safe because it was too invitational. And it's like, so how do we deal with that?
Yeah, and as you say, and if you're just working in a studio setting, I'm going back to yoga teaching. You're working in a studio setting, you turn up for your allotted slot. You don't even know who's going to be in there. So, as you say, I mean, 80% of those people could have had trauma of some sort, and you don't know what they need to feel safe. How can I say I'm creating a safe space? I don't know what you need to be safe. I'll do my best to create something that I think is safe, but it might not be. You might really need those instructions.
Yeah, I remember you putting this out once when there was Amy saying, when someone said just saying something isn't a safe space. I mean, I always joke in my own head when everyone says this is a safe space. I say, well, no, because I'm in the room, so it's not a safe space. As a kind of predatory animal, I object to it being called a safe space when I'm there. So the idea of it is almost offensive to me, if I'm honest. But telling people that it's a safe space, it's like, well, what do you mean by that? Do you mean that I won't be abused? Great. Do you mean that I can take a rest? Great. Like, tell me what you mean by that. Don't just tell me it's a safe space.
Yeah. And this is what I'm learning with the trauma-informed approach, is that when I start with a group, I say, this is what I'm creating here, but you need to tell me what else you need. What do you need to help make this a safe place to practice yoga?
And let's talk a little bit about the trauma-informed approach, because Paul Linder, my main mentor, works with abuse survivors, so I kind of was quite early on this one. And years ago, I was sort of shouting about how yoga needs to be more trauma-informed, and now it seems like trauma-informed has become a very set idea. Like, you have to have people in rows, you have to have it this way. Let's talk about some of the positives though first. Like, maybe people listen to this aren't yoga teachers, but they might teach dance, or like martial arts is horribly under trauma-informed. What are some of the things that are kind of helpful to know about if you're a body mind teacher in terms of sort of basic trauma education?
I think what I've learned is just to assume everyone has some kind of has had some kind of traumatic experience to start with, so that I start from that starting point now. I think the most important thing for me is realizing that the trauma recovery goes in stages, and there's probably a different approach at a top level. There are different approaches at different stages of recovery. And very early on, from what I've understood in trauma recovery, is that the pathway to the felt sense of reconnecting to the body is the first hurdle, if you like, the first part of the practice. So we can't assume that everyone has great connections to the body.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few assumptions, isn't there? Like, one is that people can feel their bodies, and that's A, they can do it, B, they fucking want to do it or not. It might just be like we have one student at the moment, I won't give too many details, but they're basically they don't want to do a body meditation because actually they've been beaten up not long ago. And this person's in Russia, and it was motivated by kind of sexuality type stuff, and they're like, hey, I don't want to do a body meditation, it doesn't feel good physically, let alone emotionally. And we're like, okay, here's a sound-based meditation you can do instead, which helps you develop some mindfulness without going to the body. And luckily this person told us this, but it's like the assumption the body is a sort of A, people can go there, and B, that they want to go there, that it's some sort of happy place. Just be in your body, it's a nice place to be. No, it's fucking not for a lot of people, right?
Exactly. In fact, it's safer not to be in the body.
That's the point of dissociation, right?
Exactly. And so you're absolutely right. So you have to find non-physical or non-body based, which is challenging for someone like me who feels very attuned to her own body, to then find other pathways for people to reconnect. Yeah, sound is a great way, because that's also a movement.
It's present moment, and it brings people into the moment without necessarily. So whatever assumptions are there, like, I mean, there isn't, in like the UK, the stats are as 80% lifetime prevalence of traumatic incidents. That doesn't mean everyone has PTSD or whatever. So, it was not far off to assume that people have all had trauma, just in terms of the stats. Without sort of turning everything into trauma, there's a way in which I think if we say everything's trauma, the word starts to mean nothing, and that devalues it for people who have had, multiple gang rapes or something, like something hardcore. I don't want to devalue the word by turning everything into trauma, but it's certainly perhaps an unhelpful assumption to think that you've got a group of undamaged, normal people, in inverted commas, in the room, right?
I think so. I think we've got to be careful. I know what you mean. I think I know what you mean. There's a sort of wave of sort of kind of trauma sensitivity language coming in, certainly into the yoga world. Obviously, in the therapy world, it's been around for longer, and it's almost like that's the next CPD that everybody's got to do. And I would agree. I think there needs to be more trauma sensitivity within teacher trainings, definitely.
Just basic, as part of basic training, right?
It should be part of basic training. I would totally advocate for that. But what we don't want to do is it feels to me as if this whole sense of trauma-informed yoga is just beginning to open up and provide perhaps some outreach or some accessibility to people who haven't been able to get to a class, or who've been to classes and it hasn't been right for them. So I think it's good that we're seeing more of it for that population out there who would like to explore yoga as a way of either befriending the body or finding resources in their body. But we want more to happen. We don't want to just suddenly say, well, it's just a trend, and we've got to be careful of that. I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on that. And basic stuff, just like care and adjustments, right? Like not grabbing people, stuff around consent, stuff around ethics with students.
Absolutely.
Like, I mean, that's kind of basic. And I'm still amazed every time a yoga teacher just grabs me and adjusts me. And I'm like, really? Aside from that, it's unsafe physically because they might not know my body. It's just like, really? Come on. And I was in a yoga class the other day and the teacher just did like a really easy opt out for adjustments. And I thought, oh, that's nice. I prefer an opt in, but at least it was like you had your head down, so there was no public shame. We're all in beginning of class, all in child's pose. And he just said, just put your hand up if you prefer not to have adjustments today. And he really said it in a pleasant way. And I thought, okay, that's the sort of thing which is progress. I hadn't heard that till a few years ago. 10 years ago, I'd never heard anyone say anything like that. And I was like, okay, that's progress. There's some sense that people are becoming aware of opt-ins and opt-outs. And I've seen those cards they sometimes have. And I like those. I think that's a real easy one, no adjustments today. So it does seem like, on the positive that people are getting some more knowledge about this. And, I do worry a little bit, though, that therapy language and therapy terms are sort of infecting every part of embodiment. And there is a difference between someone walking into a one-to-one session with a therapist and saying, you know what, I'm really unhappy. I've got this issue. I want to work on it. And I mean, in that situation, obviously therapists are very careful and there's certain assumptions, but is it not okay to assume a certain amount of robustness in people?
Is it what your question is? Is it okay to assume robustness?
Yeah. So on the one hand, like I totally get that many people have had traumatic experiences, but I'm not sure I want to, because my experience is if I start relating to people like eggshells and they start cracking. Yeah. Whereas if I relate to people as if they are robust adult human beings making choices, and I'm respecting those choices and boundaries, etc. So I'm not, saying we just go back to the old school way of doing things.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's something about treating everyone as terribly sensitive, which seems to be coming from the US West Coast and infecting kind of culture in embodiment generally.
I would say I think it's as a yoga practitioner and a movement therapist, and a body worker, I would say for me, it's important that I am sensitive to everyone who comes in, possibly having some trauma in their history that they may or may not disclose. But I try to always meet them where they are. They may come one-to-one and they just want to work on an aspect of their yoga practice. Something anatomical or something technique wise, for example, or they may come with a more at the top level a physical issue, like I did, a chronic sort of tension in my shoulder. So I can meet someone there in the language that they're using, but then I might just then see, is there anything else there that might be worked through? So I think there's something about the training that I've had that sort of allows me to be sensitive, but at the same time, I'm not going to project that onto everybody. If you come to me and you have a knee issue or you want to work on Chaturanga Dandasana, then we can do that. That's okay.
There's probably a healthy sort of holding there, isn't there, of meeting. And maybe it's worth listeners reflecting, like, what is the culture they come from? Because on the one hand, we've got, say, for example, my next two interviews, one is with a professional comedian, improviser, and the next is with a professional martial artist. These are the next two interviews I'm doing for the podcast, right? And those guys have got radically different assumptions than you have as someone who's trained as a therapist and as a trauma-sensitive yoga teacher. On the comedians are just like, look, it's all about fun and you've come here for a good time. You've come to my improv class to have a laugh and, and that's fine. But they're also super aware of people being embarrassed. Like the improv people are really good at like being encouraging. And I don't know if you ever saw Rachel or Liz's session on EFC, and they encourage you and they clap, and they're very good at sort of social shame, and they understand how difficult it can be to be creative and to put yourself up in public. They're really good with that, but they're not so good with trauma. And then the martial artists, well, their assumption is you walked into my dojo. If you can't hack it, that's your problem.
Yeah.
And it's a very different assumption. Old school martial artists. We had Philip Smith on here from Aikido, who's really trained some very hard Aikido. And, he was talking about, what was the word he used? It wasn't traumatic, but it was like severity. He was kind of saying, people need to go through a period of very severe training. And some of the things he was saying, I imagine, would horrify most movement therapists. But from his point of view, it's just completely logical. So it's worth reflecting, like, where we come from and where, I have my blind spots coming from Aikido and business. Again, working in business, there's very much an assumption of robustness. And then if people are coming from therapy, sometimes we find them on EFC, for example. It's a course, just for listeners, it's a course where people come from all different backgrounds. They can be almost a little too careful and precious, It's interesting to know where your blind spots might be, I think.
Absolutely. But isn't it wonderful that we've got all these different people to work with? That's what I would say. I thought, wow, but when I work with your team on EFC, like there's Rachel there, there's you, there's dramatists, there's improv artists, there's martial artists, there's me, and that's what I like about the faculties that I work with. And with IBMT, you get people coming from all sorts of different backgrounds to study, and I think that's wonderful. That is wonderful, because everyone will take the stuff out into their own world, because people will seek out what they need or what they think they need.
And one of the things that I love doing both on EFC and on this show is offering people the spectrum and really putting my hand up and saying, I know I'm biased personally, and because of my background, I have my flaws and my strengths. And it's like, I think we're in this wonderful world now. It's so cool that things are coming together, and that it's like a smorgasbord of sort of things. And that's part of my mission on this show, is trying to sort of offer that diversity to people, like real diversity.
Absolutely. Just, the pathway,
And another big.
What that shows to me is that there's many pathways to so-called embodiment, and it depends how far you go along these paths.
And another thing I've been very interested on the show is cultural background. And I know, like me, you work in different countries. Is there any interesting observations you've had of embodiment or teaching embodiment in other places you've worked?
Yes, I think that's a definite yes. It's different. I mean, as you know, working in Russia is a very different culture. But there's what really strikes me over and above anything is the thirst or the drawing of it. The people who come to the trainings, they're just so receptive. They kind of want the knowledge. It feels like there's almost a sponge-like thirst for this kind of embodiment knowledge, which seems for me to point to something that's been lacking somewhere. People offering embodiment practices are offering a piece that doesn't seem to have been there for a long time.
Yeah, there's a thirst there in the whole of Eastern Europe. I've seen that get a little bit less in some of the EU Eastern European countries in the last 10 years, teaching in Poland and places like that, but or the Baltics. But it's definitely that thirst there. And I almost feel it comes from a feeling of scarcity, actually. People are really trying to get me and ask me questions. And I'm like, look, I want to go to bed. It's 10 o'clock at night. I want to go eat some food and go home, And it's wonderful on the one hand, but there's that thirst there, that genuine sort of hunger for it. And I wonder if we're not a bit spoiled in Britain, and even more so in the States. It's like, I was at a festival at the weekend, and there's a way in which, I talk to people and they're like, yeah, I've done Tantra and I've done this and I've done that. And we can all get a bit spoiled somehow.
Yeah, it's like when you said smorgasbord. I mean, you don't want to go to an all-you-can-eat buffet. It's not good for you. I think at some point, you can. I think this is an interesting thread, because what is it all about anyway? What is embodiment all about? And for me, actually, it's about self-discovery. It's also about my connections to my interior world and my exterior world. And are we doing the whole bypassing thing if we're picking a bit of this and picking a bit of that?
It's easy not really to go in, isn't it? Like, it's sort of like having 20 girlfriends and never getting married, and actually having to confront the difficult stuff with one.
Yeah.
And I think
what is that?
There's a relationship which the depth brings out, and the commitment brings out. I sound so old school. My really conservative Aikido teacher, William Smith, would love this. He used to say to me, there's no real pleasure mark without commitment. And I just used to think he was an old conservative royalist, And now I really see what he was getting at in terms of, 20 years into a relationship with Aikido and being married. And it's like sort of seeing some of that depth. And it's easy not to have that depth because there's always something shiny and sexy, isn't there, in the sort of modern embodiment supermarket?
Yeah, it would seem to be. And I think there's something about the older ways of choosing, like the martial artist path, yoga path, or a dance path, whatever it is. There's something about a commitment to that, to really go into the labyrinth and then out again, and kind of skirt down the edge.
And, old school martial artists would make you wait outside their house in the rain for days before they would talk to you. They had these ways or you had to climb up the mountain, literally, to sort of, you'd have to have that commitment to get to the mountain or into the desert. And on EFC next year, we're actually going to ask people to sacrifice something. We're actually going to ask people to burn something they care about, which might sound completely, and, it's up to them what it is. Yeah. And it's another reason I find expensive courses can be quite good in that people are, fully committed. It's not always money, though. We've got a course going on at the moment that starts at 7:30 in the morning. It's an online course, but just getting up at 7:30, people have sacrificed. They've sacrificed sleep.
Yeah, exactly. My original yoga training, I was up at 4:30 to start at 5. And now if you get a 10:30 start, that
yeah, people tell me, it's a bit early, 9 a.m. Get out of fucking bed. That's the sign. And also, as you say, like if I made you a meal and say, Beverly, I've made you a meal, it's a little bit Chinese, a little bit Indian, a little bit Mexican. Yeah. You'd be like, it doesn't sound very nice. Do you know what I mean?
I might be awfully polite. I'm awfully polite, so I probably would eat it.
You'd be British and polite. Let's talk about that. We've never had that on the show. No, I'm not very polite for an English person. You're much more classically English than me. I think we both agree on that. Is that fair to say?
I might have to take that. I guess.
I say that as a compliment, not as an insult. But that polite British thing of saying please and sorry. And someone today, I said, I was looking for a mug in the tea break in this corporate training I was doing. And I said, where are the mugs? And they said, sorry, they're over here. And I was like, why are you apologizing? You haven't, I just don't know where the mugs are. And I wonder if there's something in that politeness that's quite a sort of, it's classically, stereotypically British, isn't it? But
apparently, yeah, whatever that it means now. Maybe it's, I don't know how to respond to that.
Okay, I'm just putting it out as something to play with.
I'm just trying to figure out where that is in my body when I'm being polite. I'm quite in my skin when I'm being polite, but I'm also being quite fluid.
Okay.
So I was just trying to get where am I when I'm being polite.
It's nice, isn't it? It's nice. It's one to explore.
Which is what I really like about the whole IBMT or BMC. It's like, well, where am I in my, when I was preparing or thinking about this, and I was thinking, I feel a bit anxious. Why am I feeling anxious? And then I could just feel, kind of a little buzzy endocrine thing going on. And then obviously knowing you, and once it all starts, I can feel, I settle much more into my connective tissues. Is that me bleeping?
I think so, yeah. There's a bleepy thing there. So it might be an open app or something like that. Let's not worry about it too much. I think the odd bleep people can cope with. Yeah, I mean, and what Beverly, I mean, you've done a lot of different stuff. It's, your yoga, I imagine, is very evolved from how it was.
Yes.
Your therapy one-to-one or using all sorts of tools. What's most interesting to you now in the embodiment world?
What's most interesting to me now is how is this, which is probably indicative of the book I just got, and I can't remember the name of the author. It's about embodied social justice.
Okay.
So it's about how embodiment, or how as an embodied, if I consider myself an embodied person, what can I give back? How can that make a difference to the world? What can I put back? And I think that's partly to where I am chronologically where I am in life. But, I feel, privileged to have done the trainings, to be living in the UK and all these things that I have just because of where I've been born. So what can I do? What can I put back through my embodiment?
Interesting. Yeah.
That's where I am.
I mean, there was a phrase I heard a while back, which I love, which was the failure of trickle-down spirituality. The idea that there's a small elite group who can afford to do workshops, and it's really expensive to do workshops. It's pretty expensive to do yoga. Yoga is one of the more accessible things, at 10, 15 pounds a class in London. A lot of London cannot afford to do a yoga class, more than once a week, if at all. And yes, there's community classes and donation classes, but they're not always convenient. The failure of trickle-down embodiment, that if just enough middle-class people in Brighton and Cambridge or Boulder and San Francisco or wherever did embodiment, somehow that would make the world a better place. And I would like to just say that project has failed. And it's like, well, what else is there? How do we actually contribute? For me, it's been, how do I scale some of this stuff to make it, I've got £20 courses now, as well as £3,000 courses. And it's like, how do we scale it? How do we make it accessible, both in, financially, but also in terms of language, in terms of culture? Like this is, for me, is a really interesting one in the modern world. And I just don't think a few people at Esalen doing body practices in their, nice middle-class environment is going to change the world. I hope it doesn't sound too harsh.
No, I think this is probably where what I'm picking up, and maybe it's something that's in the zeitgeist, or maybe it's just in my social media bubble, but I think there is an awareness, or is it an awareness? Yes, it's an awareness, but it's also an impulse. There's an impulse that embodiment has to trickle down, as you're saying, has to trickle down. If it's so important, if as embodiment practitioners, if we've found a value in it, then how can we, I'm moving my hands again. How can we make a difference? I know that sounds cliche, but why not? Why not use a cliche? Yeah. How can I make a difference? Yeah.
Well, if this stuff is so good, we want to share it, right? If we say this stuff is really important, and then our next breath say, yeah, but sorry, it's only available to the top 15% of people in the UK or top 5% of people in the world in terms of economics, then we've said we're depriving something important from people who, as you say, by an accident of birth, don't have access to it. They didn't grow up in, I grew up in Cambridgeshire, even though my family are relatively poor, it's still a fairly affluent area. And compared to, the first two places I taught Aikido were the slums of Brazil and in Ethiopia. So, both of those places were pretty poor and pretty rough. And I was aware the concerns of students were very different. I remember once a student had dirty hands in the training in Aikido. I said, go wash your hands. You can't come to training with dirty hands. And someone explained to me they were too poor to buy soap. And I was like, whoa. Even though a bar of soap costs 50 cents or whatever, like this person, and actually our bar of soap got stolen from the bathroom because someone was like, well, I need a bar of soap. And I was kind of like, well, I get that. I'm not going to, and it's like, wow, that's quite a different concern. I'm too poor to buy soap is quite a different concern from what do you think of my Lululemon yoga pants,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I don't know what the answer is, but that's the question. And that's the beautiful question. How can I make a difference through the experiences and the trainings that I've had? That's the question for me.
Yeah. Had to get this stuff out there in a new way. Well, hopefully the podcast is one small way to put the information out, right? Like we're putting world-class teachers out for free to anyone that can download them. I know not everyone's got a phone, but most people can download a podcast these days. I feel like we're putting, hundreds of hours out essentially, for free for anyone who wants it. So I feel like that's that and YouTube are two of my contributions towards that. But I know it's very, I'm thinking just in very direct terms here, but why not? Why not make this stuff open source?
Yes.
Cool. Anything else you'd like to speak about before we wrap up, Beverly? Anything that's interesting to you right now, or things that you think really that you talk about eloquently, know well, that you could add to this?
She says, lost for words. No, I just think it's great that what you're doing in bringing different speakers to the podcast, because it just gives that breadth interpretation of what embodiment is. And I suppose what the lasting message for me is that just embodiment is just becoming visible. It's just becoming visible as a human being. And then what you do with that is then over to you.
You just reminded me of authentic movement. That's another modality you work with, right? And that's one we've not really had anyone else talk about on the podcast. So if you're willing, if you've got a few minutes, like you talked about being visible, it's very much about being seen, isn't it? So could you describe what authentic movement is for people?
Well, it's moved on a little bit, but I can give a sense of what it is. So it comes from a dance movement therapy background. It comes from and there's also a Jungian psychology thread that runs through it too, because we talk a lot about the collective body as well as the individual body. So in authentic movement, very simply, you are a mover or a witness. You are, as a mover, you're invited to move from an impulse within the body. So it could be anything. And you're invited also to track your own movement, because the part of the discipline is creating a robust internal witness. In the absence of that, you have an external witness to observe your moving. So there's a little bit of moving that happens, there's some witnessing that happens, and there's a sharing of that experience. But the beautiful thing about authentic movement is that movement is arising from the unconscious. So it's not about performance as such. It's waiting to see what moves, what is ready to move from your unconscious into your conscious space.
Nice. We had a fire rhythms teacher on, Adam Barley, and I think both of these are nice complements to each other in terms of what we call on EFC freedom practices or process work, that it's coming from the body rather than making a form. And obviously there's no music in authentic movement, and this element of witnessing is key. Yeah. But I think that's a beautiful, it's another one of these classic embodiment practices, which just isn't as well known as I would like. You know, like it breaks my heart that people don't know what authentic movement is, or they don't know what Feldenkrais is, or, you know, they've never heard of body mind centering. It's like, I really want to put this stuff out there. Yeah. So Beverly, thank you so much for coming on and talking people through some of this stuff. It really got juicy for me there in the middle as well. We're talking about some of those topics. Nice to see you as ever. Any final message?
No, just keep on doing what you're doing.
Thank you. And I think it goes for everyone, not just for me, I hope. And in terms of finding out more about you, if people are in Cambridge or they want to come to some of your courses, where could they find out about you?
The best way is to check the website, so beverlynolan.com. I've got a couple of there goes the dog.
There's the dog.
Yeah. A couple of courses in development. So I'm developing a yoga teacher training that has a strong outreach element to it as well. So there's some stuff in the pipeline. But there's some current stuff on the website. Just email.
Great. I'll make sure that links up on our main website so people know that. That's Beverly Nolan, Nolan. So Beverly, it sounds like your dog needs some love. So thank you very much for joining us today. Nice to see you as ever, Beverly. Always welcome in Brighton.
Thank you very much, Mark. Take care.
Cheers. Take care. Bye-bye. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to get more. If you'd like to help us build the Embodied Tribe, leave a review on iTunes or share this on your social media. If you're interested in training globally, sign up to receive the newsletter at embodiedfacilitator.com. Until next time, welcome home to the body.